It started with a call Bill Maher almost ignored. A vague invitation to a casual dinner at the White House was the last thing he wanted to entertain. He assumed it was a mistake, or some elaborate setup for a joke he'd later dismantle on air. But as details emerged, a dinner hosted personally by Donald Trump, with Kid Rock and Dana White already confirmed, it became clear this wasn't a prank. This was real. Against every instinct, Bill accepted, not out of curiosity or diplomacy, but because something about it felt like a dare. The evening began in a private dining room dressed to impress. Crystal glasses shimmered under a chandelier as White House staff moved swiftly around a long mahogany table. Bill arrived last, his entrance quiet, his presence noticeably colder than the warm greetings shared between the others. Donald Trump sat at the head of the table, visibly pleased with the guest list he'd assembled. Kid Rock leaned back with a mischievous grin, already halfway through his first drink. Dana White, ever the dealmaker, was locked in a story about a recent clash in the sports world. Bill took a seat, avoiding small talk, watching more than speaking. From the beginning, the mood was tense but polite. Trump dominated the conversation with his signature bravado, painting vivid tales of political triumphs and media conspiracies. Bill, arms crossed, nodded sparingly, never fully engaging. He didn't come to be charmed. He came to observe, perhaps, to find the exact angle he'd later dissect for his audience. Yet even from the outset, it was clear something unexpected was forming beneath the surface. When the first course arrived, Kid Rock shifted the tone, with a few crass remarks about the current state of America's youth and the cultural shift. In music and patriotism, he drew sharp laughter from Trump and a smirk from Dana. Bill, however, remained quiet until the subject inevitably turned political. That's when the atmosphere shifted. Bill interrupted, not loudly, not aggressively, but with a sharpness that cut through the laughter. He questioned the logic behind a policy Trump had just boasted about. The room fell into a beat of silence. Trump turned toward him, not amused, not angry, but interested. What followed wasn't a shouting match, but a slow-building confrontation. Two men known for controlling the room suddenly found themselves in a silent duel of posture and patience. Trump leaned in, attempting to assert control with sheer presence. Bill didn't flinch. He countered not with volume, but with deliberate intensity. He reminded the table that behind the glamour and applause, real people bore the weight of powerful decisions. Dana White looked uncomfortable, glancing between the two as if waiting for someone to throw the first verbal punch. Kid Rock, unfazed, welcomed the tension, finding the moment entertaining rather than intimidating. The first course ended with no clear victor, but a noticeable change had taken place. Bill wasn't an outsider anymore. He had taken his seat, not just at the table but in the conversation. He wasn't there to nod along or politely disagree. He had come to challenge, and he had made that clear. The next course promised more than food. It promised escalation. As the main course was served, the air in the room grew denser, not with smoke or aroma, but with tension. The formality that once veiled the evening had peeled away, exposing raw personalities underneath. Bill Maher, now fully engaged, sat, straighter in his chair. He had gone from cautious observer to active disruptor, and the others at the table could feel it. Trump, unwilling to be challenged without response, returned the pressure with a story about legacy, how he believed his time in office had reshaped America's future, and why he felt misunderstood by the media. It wasn't a rant, but a calculated narrative. He painted himself as a warrior against an entrenched elite, a man whose every step had been resisted, but ultimately validated by history. He spoke with conviction, even pride, gesturing toward the others as if they were his jury. Bill didn't buy into the pageantry. When Trump finished, he leaned in and asked the question no one else at the table would dare to ask. He questioned the sincerity behind Trump's claim to be a voice for the people. Did a billionaire, insulated from consequence and fed applause by loyalists, truly understand the lives of ordinary Americans? The question wasn't shouted. It was delivered quietly, but it landed like a slap. Dana White shifted uncomfortably. Kid Rock chuckled, muttering something under his breath that Bill ignored. Trump, however, stared back with that familiar expression. Part ego, part calculation. There was no explosion. Instead, he answered with the calmness of a man who'd spent years deflecting criticism. But the words, though polished, carried a sting. He accused Bill of being out of touch in his own way, insulated by celebrity circles that claimed moral superiority while mocking those who thought differently. Now it was Bill's turn to sit silently. Not out of defeat, but reflection. For all his disagreements, the accusation wasn't baseless. He had, at times, mocked and dismissed the people who saw Trump as a symbol of resistance, even if he didn't respect their reasons. That realization didn't soften his stance, but it shifted the tone. The conversation was no longer about ego. It had become about understanding. What followed was less of a debate and more of an unraveling. The table began dissecting the role of media, celebrity, and truth. Kid Rock, usually more of a spectator than participant, surprised everyone by stepping in. He spoke of his disillusionment with both parties, his frustration with being boxed in as either a rebel or a puppet, depending on who was judging. Dana, perhaps seeing the dinner spiraling toward something too personal, tried to lighten the mood with another story, but the gravity had already taken hold. The confrontation between Bill and Trump simmered. Neither had won, but both had stripped something bare: ego, pride, conviction. The room was no longer filled with caricatures, but real people with wounds and fire beneath the surface. As dessert was set on the table, the conversation slowed. The food, no longer the centerpiece, was barely touched. A different kind of energy now held the room. Something had shifted. They weren't laughing anymore. They were thinking. Trump broke the silence with a mention of the Lincoln bedroom, inviting them to see it after dinner. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a casual offer, but it felt symbolic. A place tied to legacy, power, and a nation's most sacred myths. The men agreed, rising slowly, their previous tension still hanging in the air like smoke. The walk to the Lincoln bedroom was quiet. No staff accompanied them now, and the usual rustle of White House activity seemed to fade into the background. They moved like shadows through the historic corridors, the silence speaking louder than any of them could. Whatever remained of the evening's performance was being left behind. This part of the night was something different. Trump led the way, his shoulders broad, his presence unshaken despite the clash over dinner. Bill trailed just a step behind, his thoughts racing but composed. Kid Rock and Dana White followed, more subdued now, having felt the gravity of the night settle on their shoulders. When they entered the Lincoln bedroom, no one spoke. They just stood there for a moment, surrounded by the weight of history. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with a sense of preservation, almost reverence. A room where decisions, legends, and ghosts all lingered in silence. Trump turned slowly, looking at each of the men as if sizing them up again. Then, with a tone more reflective than boastful, he began to speak about legacy, not just his own, but the idea of it, what it meant to lead, to be remembered, to win or lose in the court of public opinion and history. He said it without needing to name it, but the message was clear. The idea of a third term, a comeback, a defiance of tradition, was not just a fantasy. It was something he believed he could carry forward, if not in name, then in spirit. Dana looked unsure, caught between admiration and concern. Kid Rock nodded, clearly supportive but aware of the risks. Bill, however, was unmoved. For the first time that night, Maher stepped closer, not as a rival or critic, but as someone who had seen behind the curtain. He spoke carefully, acknowledging the power in the room but questioning its direction. He challenged Trump on the very idea of clinging to power, suggesting that legacy isn't built by staying, but by knowing when to leave, when to pass the Torch without burning the house down. Trump's expression hardened, but he didn't interrupt. He listened. The others stood still, their faces unreadable. There was no applause, no crowd, no cameras. Just four men in a room where one of America's greatest presidents once slept, debating the meaning of legacy and power in a moment that felt both intimate and enormous. Kid Rock eventually broke the silence, tossing out a line that gave everyone a reason to chuckle, if only briefly. The tension didn't dissolve, but it softened enough to let the men breathe again. Trump, still facing the bed, looked over his shoulder and admitted something small but real. He was tired. Not in defeat, but in weight. The burden of being who he was, of carrying the expectations, the hate, the adoration. It was there, in his voice, even if he refused to say it plainly. Bill understood that feeling. Not the presidency, but the weight of being a voice, of being expected to always have the right answer. It was the closest they came to common ground that night. Not agreement, but recognition. As they left the bedroom, no one said much. They didn't need to. The confrontation at dinner had cleared the air. What remained was something more personal, more human. And in that silence, a strange sense of respect began to form. Uneasy, imperfect, but real. By the time they returned to the dining room, the atmosphere had completely changed. The tension had settled, replaced by a thoughtful quiet. The room looked different now, as if it too had exhaled after holding its breath all evening. Plates remained untouched, wine glasses half full, the last course of dessert barely noticed. But no one was thinking about the food anymore. They were thinking about what had just unfolded. Bill Maher remained standing as the others took their seats. Again, he paced slowly, not from nerves but from reflection. The conversations of the night had not converted anyone, nor had they ended in hugs or agreement. But there was something profound in the collision that had taken place. Four men who had little reason to be in the same room had just faced each other without handlers, without scripts, and without the protection of their usual platforms. They had clashed, challenged, and most importantly, listened. Trump, usually the master of any room he entered, looked contemplative. He was not defeated, nor humbled, but quieter than usual, as though still weighing Maher's words about legacy and power. Kid Rock reclined in his chair, tapping a finger on the table, caught in that strange in-between space where entertainment meets introspection. Dana White, forever the middleman between firebrands, looked as if he had just finished, refereeing the most high-stakes fight of his life. Bill finally sat down again, this time not across from Trump, but next to him. It wasn't a peace offering. It was a gesture of clarity. For all the noise and division that each of them represented in the public eye, here they were, still talking, still trying, in their own flawed ways, to be understood. The most surprising part came at the very end. As Bill prepared to leave, something changed in Trump's demeanor. No press was around, no assistants scribbling notes. He offered something rare, gratitude, not for agreement, but for the confrontation, for being pushed, for being seen as a man, not just a symbol. And in return, Bill gave something just as rare. Acknowledgement that not every disagreement is an enemy, not every opponent a villain. That was the heart of the night. Not a conversion, not a softening of beliefs, but the undeniable truth that conversation, real, face-to-face, uncomfortable conversation, still had power. In a world where talking often feels pointless, where shouting into the void has replaced genuine connection, this dinner had defied expectations. It had not been about changing minds. It had been about showing up, saying the hard things, and walking away with your humanity intact. As Bill Maher stepped out into the night, the cool, Washington air wrapped around him like a reminder that reality still existed outside of cameras and scripts. He didn't walk away triumphant, but he walked away clear. Clear that lines drawn in ideology are not as strong as the lines drawn in respect, that even in a room full of opponents, a moment of honesty can still break through. Back inside, the others sat in silence, each absorbing the night in his own way. They would remember this dinner not because of who won or lost, but because something happened that rarely does anymore. People listened, people spoke, and for once, the masks came off. And that, more than any soundbite or headline, was what left everyone speechless.